We will mute.
Assalamu alaikum, ThinkFest. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Today we are bringing you a reflective session on the 20-year war on terror in Afghanistan. ये सेशन अंग्रेजी में किया जाएगा, लेकिन थिंक फेस्ट के फ़ैन से ये दरख्वास्त है कि अगर आप उर्दू में शामिल होना चाहते हैं तो ज़रूर हमारे कमेंट्स बॉक्स का इस्तेमाल कीजिएगा। और सेशन के बाद अगर कोई ऐसी चीज़ है जिसका आप तर्जुमा चाहते हैं तो प्लीज़ मुझे बता दीजिएगा, आपको ज़ाती तौर पे उसका तर्जुमा करके भेज दूँगी। आज हमने ये सेशन इसलिए मुनक़िद किया है कि अफ़गानिस्तान में जो पिछले 20 साल की कहानी है वो हम अपने अफ़गान भाइयों से और हमारे गेस्ट्स जो अमेरिका से आए हैं उनसे भी हम इसके बारे में गुफ्तगू करें, तो इसलिए आपकी शमूलियत ज़रूरी है। Good evening, ThinkFest. We're bringing you this session today with three panelists from whom I have been dying to hear for a very long time. My name is Azeema Cheema. I'm a researcher based in Pakistan, and for a few years now, my research firm Verso Consulting and we have been doing research on the political economy of the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. So, as somebody who's been watching the border for a very long time, recent events in Afghanistan have, of course, been pivotal in defining how both the border will change in the future, but much more importantly, we have seen a cycle of devastation, grief, and chaos in Afghanistan, and what that means for the Afghan people, and what that means for the policies of the countries in the region, and also what that means for the US approach to the region, to Afghanistan, and to the world. We would like to discuss all of these questions. We would also like to focus on discourse, our popular discourse, the popular discourse on Afghanistan here in Pakistan, the diversity, the vast diversity of opinion on the events in Afghanistan within Afghanistan and also from within the Afghan diaspora. And also the conversation on Afghanistan that is happening in Washington and other places right now that is driving US policies and decision making. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our guests. Sangar Paykhar is a podcaster. He is based in the Netherlands and is a lecturer at Leiden University and has had a long career and also working with Afghan refugees in the EU. His podcast, Afghan Eye, is something that I have watched almost every day because they have been doing live sessions every day through the crisis of the last 2 weeks. And we've been watching carefully. So I've learned very much. So I wanted you all to hear from Sangar Paykhar. Haroun Rahimi, whose appearances in the media have taught us much about the complexity. Haroun is a lecturer, assistant professor of law at the American University of Afghanistan. Currently, he's in Istanbul. He's joining us from there. We're very, very grateful that in this very difficult time for Afghans, that people are making the time to speak with us. And I wanted to make it absolutely clear how much we appreciate your participation. Adam joins us from Washington today and will bring us that side of the conversation. Adam is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And for a long time, I've been following his insights on Afghanistan and Pakistan. So with that, I would like to invite each of our panelists to speak about the experience of the war in the last 20 years. Sangar, what happened in Afghanistan in the last 20 years. Where are we now?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. I have to state that in the last 20 years, I spent a very short amount of time in Afghanistan experiencing war. So I didn't experience war directly as an Afghan in Afghanistan in the last 20 years. However, as an observer of current events in Afghanistan and someone who was deeply involved with Afghan refugees, what I have seen in the last 20 years is international community involved in Afghanistan, and their involvement can be summarized as a combination of arrogance, ignorance, and greed, which has had devastating results for people in Afghanistan. I would say arrogance because Western countries did not think it is necessary for them to actually try to listen, understand the ground realities in Afghanistan before engaging in a invasion. Um, Ignorance because they didn't knew what was really going on in Afghanistan. For instance, even the Taliban did not support 9/11 attacks. They did not invite bin Laden in Afghanistan so that he can use Afghanistan to eventually harm other countries. And greed because military-industrial complex played a major role in perpetuating conflict in Afghanistan. And as an observer, as someone who was standing on the sidelines, I didn't have the means to shout and make people understand that this is misguidance, this is not benefiting Afghanistan and the region or the international community. But now, after 20 years, I have mixed feelings. On the one hand, I feel like some people may have finally realized how misguided everything has been in the last 20 years. But on the other hand, we're still in a situation with a lot of uncertainty, economic crisis. We don't know what the future is going to be for people in Afghanistan. So those are my reflections. Thank you.
Haroun, I'll come to you.
Obviously, it is an Herculean task to summarize 20 years of efforts by the United States, Afghan, different classes, different groups of people in Afghanistan. Just going back to the moment of invasion, I think it's important to keep in mind that the US intervened in an already complex context. You had the Civil War, you had, the Cold War context already there. There were different political parties that had connections with different commanders underground that had came out of the Cold War era. You had the Islamist politics being spread through the country at the time. You had some reactionary movements being unfolded in the country. You had the nationalist politics of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic country. The issue of nation building in the country has been unfolding for many decades. There was a lot of tensions that the breakdown of central government in Afghanistan in the 70s worsened. The moment of intervention in 2001, if you just remove Osama bin Laden as a person from Afghanistan, it was already a very complicated context with many parties, with many dynamics of conflict already ongoing. The US chose to intervene based in reaction to the event of 9/11 and based on mere presence of Osama bin Laden. It was obviously not coming out of a strategic understanding of what is unfolding in Afghanistan and no vision for what Afghanistan intervention would amount to exactly. It intervened in a complex dynamic. United States chose to intervene in a complex dynamic. Their intervention changed some of those dynamics, but some of those dynamics continued through the period of occupation of Afghanistan. What came out of it in those 20 years, you just have to realize that US tried very different things in this 20 years. It's not just, I think you cannot think of it as just one period of time. There was many periods of time, different things being tried. At some point it was counterinsurgency. At some point it was counter-terrorism. At some point it was nation building. At some point it was, but Different times it was about democracy and women rights. I mean, the US obviously did not make sense of it for itself for a very long time. And a lot of retrospection that is coming out of United States is pointing out the fact that it was not one 20-year project. It was more of multiple, often self-contradictory projects of what the US wanted to achieve in Afghanistan. From an Afghan perspective, my family came back to Afghanistan in 2003. So right after the Taliban were toppled, I was like 14 years old. We were living in Iran for a very long time. We came to Herat. That is a part of the country that has unique experience in the context of war. We have to admit that it was not a major scene of conflict for a very long time. Throughout my life, I lived there until after my college in Herat. Things were getting generally better around me. I have to say, I mean, the roads were being built, people were coming in, starting factories. There was obviously corruption, petty crimes, kidnapping. Herat is notorious for kidnapping. But a lot of people were sensing that, okay, things are not that bad. They are getting better. It was not the experience of everyone in the country. And towards the end, some people were starting to lose hope, even in Herat, about the future and how sustainable and how meaningful those changes were. I think some questions were being asked towards the end. But generally, I think a lot of people were thinking that the last 20 years have been better than have been better than what was going on in the country before the U.S. invasion. That's what the context most people had, because they were coming back to Herat as refugees, or they were coming out of the Taliban rule. Another important, so that's kind of my personal experience of going through it all. The corruption was there, the mistreatment of population was there, the human casualties of war was there. Shinden, which is part of the Herat, was bombed. One of the early places when the wedding was bombed, and tens of people, including kids, were killed. So those moments existed, and Afghans obviously felt strongly about those moments. But overall, generally, the sense was that the last 20 years were better compared to a hypothetical people would have in terms of continuation of what they were feeling before the moment of invasion. The other thing I would like to talk about was that's my personal experience. Stepping out, looking at it from an observer, like a nation kind of wide view, I think that it is very hard to think of one Afghan experience for the past 20 years. There have been many, many experiences. And I think what we see right now is a moment of reckoning. The nation is coming to reckon with some of those diverse experiences. The gains of the past 20 years were obviously unequally distributed. The cost of the past 20 years, the brutal cost of war on terror, was not evenly distributed. And I think a big part of what's happening in the country is just a reckoning of all the bloodshed that happened, all the destruction was caused, and also all the gains that were made in many aspects, and how a country that is left now is going to reckon with all of those things. I'm going to stop here, and obviously we can explore many of those things more.
No, thank you so much for that, Haroun. Adam, how do you see it all?
Well, thanks for having me. And, I only played a minor role in the war in that I deployed as a Marine in 2012. So that's just a snapshot of one part of the conflict that happened at the end of the tail end of the U.S. surge in Afghanistan. The origins of this war were a counterterrorism response to the attacks on 9/11. And then from then on, it becomes, much more complex. I think if there was one way to summarize the U.S. approach to this war, it has been assumptions without much evidence for those assumptions. And, a lot of the things that we've come to just take as almost doctrine or dogma in the United States, I think are half truths, or they have some truth to them, but they don't tell the full story. I mean, it became just accepted almost as doctrine about Afghanistan that Taliban were a proxy force of Pakistan, and the Afghan government was this legitimate elected government, and this is what the war was about. The reality is that both the Afghan government and the Taliban had elements of proxy relationships with different powers. And this isn't even that surprising, given in a civil war and an insurgency, there's oftentimes outside third-party influencers. I mean, did the Taliban have elements of a proxy relationship with Pakistan? Sure. Did that mean that the Taliban aren't part of Afghan society, weren't sustainable on their own, and were completely obedient to Pakistan? No. I mean, that's ridiculous. They have a diverse funding model. Much of their money came from their own activities. And I don't think Pakistan had nearly as much control over the Afghan Taliban as people in Washington, D.C. claimed it did. It just became something people repeated. Then we look at the Ghani administration. Does this not look like a proxy? An administration that flies away to Dubai? Does that not look like a proxy? I mean, if we step back with common sense and just, it doesn't mean the republic itself is a proxy, but the people that the United States chose to invest in behaved as proxies, and they had a legitimacy problem as a result. We look at US statements about Afghanistan and about what our commitment really was. Well, we're committed to human rights. We're committed to Afghan women. We're committed to the republic. Look, in personal life and in politics, whenever somebody begins to talk to you in a way that pretends as if they don't have self-interest and their only interests are about you, that should raise a red flag. Most of the statements that the United States about Afghanistan were about its own optics. They had very little truth. There's no such thing as a promise. If we look at the scandal of the US intervention in Afghanistan, it's not so much that the United States went back on its promises. It's that it made promises that it never had any intention of keeping, by the way. It never had any intention of keeping these promises that it made. How could it possibly have an intention of keeping them? I think we have to, that takes us to US electoral politics. I think because of many of the statements that US politicians made about Afghanistan, and I sort of understand how this came to be, I think some elements of Afghan civil society and even Afghan government officials began to view Afghanistan as if it were more important to US interests than it actually is. I do not agree with some people in Washington who think, well, we should withdraw from Afghanistan and we should wipe our hands clean of it, and whatever happens in Afghanistan has no effect on the United States or the world. I don't agree with that. But at the same time, Afghanistan never was going to be at the level of importance to US strategic interests that would justify continuous open-ended conflict. And even if that calculation was made, the people making that calculation did not have Afghan interests in mind. They had other interests in mind. It had nothing to do with the stability of Afghanistan. If you want evidence of that, the majority of the people supporting a continuous US military intervention in Afghanistan don't even consider the fact that 10,000 ANDSF were killed in the last 2 years, each year. They don't even consider that as a factor, or close to 2,000 Afghan civilians killed. That's an afterthought, That's just a collateral damage that we should go through. When you really distill the arguments, I think there's a few people in the human rights community who perhaps genuinely believe that staying in Afghanistan militarily is valuable due to its ability to sustain a certain amount of civil liberties in the cities, etc. But if you look at the majority of arguments for staying in Afghanistan militarily and you really distill the reasoning, it comes down to counterterrorism or some unhinged argument about great power competition. It has absolutely nothing to do with the stability of Afghanistan or the well-being of Afghan people. They use that to make the pill easier to swallow. So I think we also have to remember that US domestic politics does affect war. I think because US politicians made so many flowery statements about what we were doing in Afghanistan, people began to believe that the domestic US public actually really believed in this war effort. And I just don't think that's true. The polling suggests it's not true. Many of them were indifferent. I think most people leaned a little bit towards ending the war. If you talk to the average American on the street, it just doesn't compute with them. It doesn't make sense to them to stay militarily involved in a country for 20 years. It defies their own common sense. By the way, I'm not in Washington, D.C. I'm in New York. And I think being outside of Washington, D.C. has been helpful to keeping some perspective about this. And then I think we also have to just have a little bit of humility about our own assumptions that we made. Look, I was an advocate for the withdrawal. I own that position. And I made that position because I believed it was in the US interest not to continue an active 20-year war. And I'll admit that. And I understand why Afghans were hostile to that position, or at least some Afghans were hostile to that position. I fully understand that. But this goes back to what I'm saying. When people begin to speak to you as if they have no self-interest, a red flag really should go up, especially when those people are government officials, by the way. But I also had the assumption that when we withdrew, it would turn into a civil war of sorts or a deteriorating stalemate. I never thought that we would just see a rapid Taliban takeover. I don't think many people saw. So anything we ever say should be taken with a grain of salt, because clearly none of us understand Afghanistan well enough that we're just predicting the future. And especially not myself. I'm not an Afghanistan expert. But yet this rapid collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban takeover that followed really calls on the US to really do some soul searching, because, I'm not a supporter of the Taliban, and I would rather see an inclusive government or a transitional government than what we've seen now. But the reality is that I think it's become almost undeniable that the United States intervention had disrupted the power dynamics on the ground and was keeping this extremely violent war going. I mean, can you imagine if 1 month ago any American had said, oh, by the way, we think that the Afghan government will collapse in a matter of weeks, but the withdrawal still makes sense? You simply weren't allowed to say something like that. It would have been a couple people said that, but for the most part, the assumption was that the Afghan state would hold on. And that just shows that even the biggest critics of the corruption and the dysfunction that was inherent in the Afghan state, especially the Ghani administration, even we overestimated its capacity. So I think that should, be a cause for some reflection. And then I guess looking forward, I think it's important that the United States not hold Afghan people hostage to the fact that we don't like how things turned out. If this war were to transition from a direct military war to an economic war, I think that would be a disaster. Does that mean we should recognize the Taliban government tomorrow? No. Does that mean we have to endorse their statements and their actions and we shouldn't criticize them? No. But if what we're going to simply do is transition to knee-jerk sanctions, knee-jerk just isolating Afghanistan, I mean, that would be a real human tragedy. So I hope that the international community is a little bit more creative than that going forward.
I have three things coming out of the reflections that you have given, and I have a separate question for each of you. But first, I want to give you the floor in case you have any questions for each other, and of course for me as well. I'm happy to answer any of your questions. But any reactions to what each of you has said?
I mean, the hindsight, looking back at what happened, I think it is an important perspective moving forward. I would like to stress the point that the government of Afghanistan, the Ghani administration, or even Karzai administration, should not be the focal point of looking at the transformation that occurred inside the country for the past 20 years. Sometimes the collapse of Afghan government and Afghan state is translated by many into popular support for the Taliban, and the fact that the Taliban narrative has had full kind of credibility to it. I think it could be true that the Afghan government was incredibly corrupt and lacked legitimacy, and obviously was not capable of standing on its own. At the same time, it could be true that the Taliban are a well-organized minority group that are very good at manipulating local power dynamic to take over cities fast. Both could be true. I don't think developments can be attributed to popularity at this point. Especially, it could not be interpreted as endorsement of ideological divide that exists between the Republic worldview and the Taliban worldview. It's not a question. It was obviously not a question, but a comment. And I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But it's a matter of degree of how much of those statements are true, what would implications be in terms of policy and moving forward, and what it means for the past efforts. That's a different question, and obviously it's a more complicated question.
Yeah,
Haroun,
I want to endorse.
Nicely. Sorry, Adam. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just want to endorse what Haroun said, and I have seen people in the U.S. say that, Taliban had all this legitimacy and Afghan government did, and it was more. I think they both have a legitimacy problem right now. It's just that the Taliban is more cohesive and more organized, which is a testament to its own movement. and what the Taliban do in the next 6 months is going to affect whether it has legitimacy or not. The Taliban right now, they have control of Afghanistan. Now they have to govern. I think, and in a separate panel, Tamim Asay said something that was interesting, where if they feel they've won the war, now they need to win the peace, and winning the peace is a little bit more difficult. So we're going to have to see real governance coming out of the Taliban. And I don't think that rejection of the Ghani administration, or not being willing to die for the Ghani administration in the final moments when it was collapsing, is necessarily a rejection of the republic itself. It's just quite a tragedy that the republic was placed in the hands of people who ran it like a shell corporation. And the United States policies encouraged that. And that's the tragedy here. There were real gains in maternal health, in education, in infrastructure. And by the way, this is precisely why we shouldn't simply transition to an economic war. Because if we were to reverse all of these gains, who knows what the future holds for Afghanistan, whether it's Taliban control or not. But if there's no infrastructure and the population is starving, the future is bleak, regardless of who is in control.
Well, what you're saying sort of segues nicely into a point that I wanted to raise, particularly about this arrangement that existed with, arrangements that existed with the Taliban. So as somebody who looks at the political economy of a particular area, what appeared to me as the operative pattern was a system of co-governance in place. And Ashley Jackson's work, she wrote a book on civilian insurgent relations, and ODI released her report as well, and there was a very good panel discussion in which she described this paradigm in detail, and that was in 2018. So I'm wondering if this impression that the Taliban in rural areas and vast rural constituencies of Afghanistan, particularly areas around the borders, areas that aren't, so close to the major urban centers, were operating under a system of co-governance between local elders and local communities, Taliban representatives and state representatives. Haroun, what would you say to that?
I mean, if you want to simplify it, I think the government was operating in a top-down manner with very limited understanding of what was going on in the country. I think, especially in the Ghani administration, the way the power was centralized in the hands of few kind of assured that they were making decisions without understanding the full ramifications of those decisions, without understanding the dynamics they were intervening in. So it was top down. At the same time, it was mostly for interest. I mean, it saw urban population as its main client. So I think that is a correct estimate to make. Oftentimes, there were actually statements made that no matter how much of rural Afghanistan Taliban are controlling, it's inconsequential. That was kind of the sentiment that was being implied, because all the economic life or all the kind of the major population centers are still within the government control. And obviously, the events of past few weeks prove kind of those assumptions to be obviously nonsensical. So it was urban focused. It had an urban bias, especially towards the Ghani administration. I think it was a bit different under Karzai. It had an urban bias. It was top down. It was the way it was looking at things. And the Taliban, on the other hand, I think they saw the base of support in more urban Afghanistan. It was much more decentralized. It was way better at co-opting different actors in different parts of the countries. Was very good at, if you want to call it co-governing, whatever you want to call it, but they were very good at, so they were very good at, for example, the services in most of Afghanistan was provided by the Taliban, by the government, even in areas Taliban control. I think the picture of Taliban as a group that is only interested in violence is an incorrect picture. The reason for this success was that they understood certain strategies, but how you need to take control of territories, maintain support and such. Violence was a tool in the toolkit. It was used often, but it was not the only tool. And they were not unconstrained either. maybe they were not organic in most places the way they are portrayed, but they were not also an imposing force in many areas, as many would have liked to believe in Kabul. Kabul mean like the central government.
Yeah, thanks, Haroun. I want to come to Sangar. Sangar, in one of your podcasts, you actually talked about how this system was working in your village, right? You said that there was the government in the day and Taliban at night. I believe in one of the Afghan Eye podcasts, you had talked about your village. I was just wondering if you could sort of take us through that and give us a picture of that.
I will go back a few centuries even before that.
Okay.
Niccolo Machiavelli, in his The Prince, he has a few chapters about acquiring a new principality. And in there, he explains that if you want to conquer a new area, you have to factor in matters such as who are the powerful nobles there, how do the people there feel about your presence, and all these matters were explained centuries ago in a book that is still relevant, and I have been consulting that book every time after seeing new developments in Afghanistan in the last 20 years. And what I've seen is that the knowledge of how to conquer an area and hold it existed for centuries. Even Machiavelli wrote his book based on his studies of the Roman Empire. But yet we see that in Afghanistan, what is often not understood is that Afghanistan is a pre-modern society for a large part. We didn't go to the phase of enlightenment and modernization, and the modernity is still an alien concept for most Afghans. They use smartphones, they're on Facebook, but a lot of social, economical factors that were necessary to create a mindset, a way of thinking for modern Western societies, that process, we didn't see that in Afghanistan. So what happens is that groups like Taliban, who are very conservative people, mainly based in rural Afghanistan, they know this society as it is. They know what people respect, what they value, and how people want to live. As much as this may conflict to popular opinions that Taliban are just extremist radicals trained in madrasas in Pakistan, I have to say that actually the Taliban know exactly how Afghan society functions. So, for example, in our village, what happens is that our village was colloquially called Moscow Kochak, or Little Moscow, in the 80s, because a lot of people from our village worked for the communist government. And after US invasion, many people from my village started working for the Karzai and later the Ghani government. Yet in our village, at night, it was Taliban rule. In daytime, yes, the government, the armed forces, they wouldn't even venture that much into our village because it's very far away from the city of Kabul, even though we're part of Kabul province. There isn't much going on in our village, so you won't see a lot of convoys patrolling or anything. But in nighttime, a lot of boys from our village were involved in insurgency, while their own cousins were working for the government. And this reality is because in rural Afghanistan, people have not really been submerged into a functioning system of government with its institutions, with its legal system. All these matters are confined to urban areas. Even in a city like Kabul, in its rural parts, in its districts outside the city, people go to the Taliban court to resolve their conflicts. If there is an issue about land, about any other conflict, they would go to the Taliban, not because they don't believe in justice or anything, but because they know that they will get results over there and not in Kabul. And this is a problem of the occupation. The occupation created a regime that had the power, the resources to function as a government, but it wasn't, as Haroun said, organic. It wasn't based in the society. It wasn't accepted by all people in Afghanistan. It only served the interests of certain groups. And for that reason, it was also very easy for the Taliban to get rid of that regime within 10 days. Because they understand that if they go to a particular district that is on paper ruled by the regime, they just have to approach the local council of elders, the shopkeepers, the council of businessmen, and say, listen, war and fighting in your district is not going to benefit anyone. We don't want to disturb your life. All you have to do is go and tell the guys in the garrison that if they don't fight, we won't hurt them, and you can appear as guarantors. And in Afghan society, local elders, local shuras, they have a lot of credibility within the society. People believe them. If they say, we are the guarantors, we will make sure that these guys, they will do what they have promised, then other people have the confidence to trust them. So this is how the Taliban managed to take so many territory, because they told these guys, you can trust us, we're not going to kill anyone. And you saw within 10 days, the whole country fell into their hands. There was fighting.
Sorry. So Oni, I want to read something to you, which is a reflection from an Afghan Norwegian veteran who then went on to work in Afghanistan in the humanitarian sector, particularly vaccinating polio-afflicted children, polio-affected communities. And I've known her for many years, and I found this quite moving. And I wanted to get your reactions, particularly Haroun and Adam, to this. And also we can combine that with your reaction to whatever Sangar has just said. She says, this is Aisha Wallace-Small, who is a Norwegian Afghan. She says, as the poster child of the military intervention and international presence in Afghanistan, I feel responsible. As someone who spent most of my young professional life serving Norway and propagating so-called Western values, I feel directly responsible for the disastrous exit from Afghanistan. I should have known better. I should have somehow seen this coming, but I didn't. She also says, for years we tested our theories on the ground and refused to accept reality as it was. The best and brightest amongst us all had an opinion about Afghanistan, how to fix it. And we all had our moments to shine. The soldiers, the diplomats, the journalists, the academics, all of whom used Afghanistan as a stepping stone to accelerate their careers, myself included. Afghanistan is more than a career. It is more than just a military or academic exercise. It is more than a theater of war or an academic case study. It is the land and soil of millions of people that have been on the receiving end of war. It is also the land of millions of people who work tirelessly for their country, each in their own way. I just hope it doesn't take another 20 years before we realize it. I just hope that when the dust settles, all the diplomats, humanitarians, and other representatives of the international community return back to Afghanistan to face reality as it is, to undo as much of the damage by maintaining funding for humanitarian and development efforts, and last but not least, to hold the Taliban government accountable every step of the way. So,
may I respond?
yes.
Okay. So I agree with most part of what Aisha Walasmal has written, and that has been mainly my criticism, or the criticism of the platform that I represent, the Afghan Eye, and that is that, social political changes in most part of the world are not a product of just ideas. When they say America is built on ideas, this country was built on ideas, that's just simply not true. It was based on colonization, the Industrial Revolution, the wealth that emerged out of those major historic events. Those major historic events contributed to change of people's perceptions and ideas, and the creation of the modern liberal world order, the secular liberal values of Western world. And what happened in the last 20 years is actually something that we have seen throughout the 20th century as well. Afghans who have had some exposure with Western thought and Western ideas, they thought that they could go back to their own country and through the barrel of a gun impose those ideas on their own people, because they did it with good intentions. They believe that if these ideas are implemented and accepted by people in Afghanistan, we will be a prosperous country and people's life will improve. However, they didn't counter in that you cannot impose ideas on people and then expect the same results as in other countries. And this is also what caused a lot of resentment, a lot of aggression from conservative rural communities in Afghanistan against the communist regime first, and then later the US occupation. And many Afghans, like Aisha al-Asmal, they really care about their people. They love their country, and they weren't there just basically because they wanted to advance their own careers. Sure, that had some, it played a role there, but I know many such people. Many Afghans here from the Netherlands went back to Afghanistan working for government and NGOs. They really believe that they are helping their people, but while they were there, they saw that people hated them. Local people, even in Kabul, common people, they said that if I don't pay these people, if they don't receive something from me, they will treat me just as a foreigner. And this factor, it needs to be acknowledged. We need to acknowledge
Sangar,
that.
I think Haroun is itching to come in here.
No, actually, I'm just uncomfortable sitting here. I don't have a comfortable chair. I was not itching to come in.
No, but you're welcome to.
I will speak last.
You will speak last. Okay.
Well, because
Adam.
career in helping Afghanistan, I think it was the element of from outside coming in. And I mean, Adam spent some time there, so I think I would like to hear from him, and I will speak last.
Sure. Adam, what's your reaction?
Well, I spent some time in Afghanistan as an enlisted U.S. Marine, so it was not to help Afghanistan per se. It was in furtherance of the Marine Corps' mission, and it certainly wasn't for economic gain, because the Marine Corps is not the best paying institution. But, you know, going back to what Sangar says about the way the Taliban were able to deal with local power brokers and basically get tribal elders to act as guarantors for surrenders, and his reference to the prince, it's kind of funny he referenced the prince, because I've been saying over the last few months, the way the Taliban had approached things was nothing short of Machiavellian. And I think the prince, I mean, they really did, whether they read the prince or not, they took its lessons. And the phrase I've used for it at times was they weaponized the prisoner's dilemma, which was if you're at an outpost somewhere, an ANDS outpost, do you want to fight and die if you think the other outpost is going to surrender, or that the central government has a plan B, which clearly the Ghani administration did. So they weaponized the prisoner's dilemma. And it's not that, you know, I do reject the American criticism that the ANDSF just didn't want to fight. They obviously fought. They were losing 10,000 people a year. They were fighting. They just, in the final moments, as they saw that the Ghani administration was crumbling around it, are you going to die for that? That's just not human nature. And I think that's what happened. And the Taliban were very good at exploiting that situation. And of course, the reason they were able to exploit it was because they understood the weakness of the Ghani administration. Again, making a distinction between the Ghani administration and the concept of the republic itself, which I think Haroun said quite eloquently earlier, which is that, you know, just because an administration or a few political elites don't have legitimacy doesn't mean that the system itself doesn't have legitimacy. But unfortunately, a system or a republic without leadership is like a car without an engine or a car without a driver. It simply can't go forward, even no matter how high quality the concept of the car is. in terms of what was said, look, a lot of what we're going to see in Washington is now that the grants and the funding dries up, we're going to see who's talking about Afghanistan in 6 months. And that will be really interesting to see who's still talking about Afghanistan. There were people who were dedicated to it and people who weren't. I do care about the future of Afghanistan. I've always been honest that the policy positions I put forward, I think, are based on what I think is in the U.S. interest. But I do think the United States has a moral obligation not to engage in perpetual war in Afghanistan, but not to wipe its hands clean of Afghanistan. The United States disrupted the power dynamics for the last 40 years, and especially in the last 20 years. The United States has an obligation from an aid perspective, from a diplomacy perspective, from a just staying involved perspective to the Afghan people. I mean, as much as I think it's a tragedy what happened to the Marines, my fellow Marines last week, there's a part of me that says, you know what? At the end of the day, they were trying to get people out. They were engaged in a humanitarian mission, and better. I'd rather see. I don't know how to put this in a way, but to me, that was less tragic than seeing Marines die for some futile patrol in Helmand province, for a piece of ground that was going to return to the Taliban that same night. How many Marines died doing that? But we have to remember something. This is an important point, and then I'll let it go. Every U.S. military action in Afghanistan comes with a cost. And even this mission to evacuate Afghans, which I supported, the cost was that it created a frenzy at the airport, and it created an opportunity for ISKP to murder innocent Afghans. There's no such thing as sending U.S. troops in Afghanistan with no collateral damage, with no cost. Even this mission that seemed so morally clear from the United States perspective, we're helping get our Afghan partners out. Something I supported. But what is the cost? It created a frenzy in a country where people are desperate, partially because some folks are scared of Taliban rule, and partially because you have a country that has been in poverty, and people see what they think is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get to the United States, and you create this frenzy around the airport, and a non-state actor exploits it, and now Afghans have been killed by the hundreds. And this is connected to a U.S. action. You cannot, there's no such thing as a U.S. military action in a country that is purely altruistic. It just doesn't happen. It always comes with a cost, and we have to be clear-eyed about that.
I want to just throw this in before we go to Haroun. This came from a Pakistani anthropologist who is in the US right now, who was making a case for the left view as opposed to the liberal view of the war. He says the whole language of failure in Afghanistan, failure in inverted commas, is shaped by the liberal view. I keep returning to this because it assumes that the idealist motivations purported by the US were actually the structuring logic of the war and occupation. So agree, disagree. Haroun, the floor is yours.
So, I would like to start by saying Afghanistan, what happened in the past 20 years or what happened throughout Afghan history is very complex. I don't think there is a simple explanation for what happened in the past 20 years, or if you go back even from the start of conflict in the 70s, there are internal factors, there are external factors, and we can debate what are the prominent causes. And I think there is an element of worldview here. You can look at the same facts, interpret them differently, give weight to different kind of factors. Just to pick up some of the themes that were talked about. First, about the Taliban genius and of manipulating local dynamics or surviving or thriving in rural Afghanistan. You have to realize that it wasn't insurgency. So the purpose was to cause the Afghan government to collapse or to challenge Afghan government rule. The purpose was not to govern. And now we're going to see how it can govern. Taliban, can they govern or not? That's a question that is going to be answered now. What takes to succeed as an insurgency is quite different than what it takes to succeed as a government. Afghan government was doing something trying to do something completely different than the Taliban, and saying that one was, it's not the same measures of judging the two, just saying Taliban were better at X. Government was not doing X. Government was trying to govern, provide services, have legitimacy, and people were not holding Taliban and Afghan government to the same standards. I think Afghans clearly saw the difference in the purpose, the objectives, what they were doing. So again, the actions and the events unfolded can be interpreted differently, but I think some people saying that Taliban, the way they conducted the insurgency is the way Afghans want their society to be organized or to be governed. I think that's just misunderstanding of what the insurgency was, why it succeeded, why the Afghan government failed. There were two different things happening. The government was doing something very different than the Taliban were doing. And one of them was very good at insurgency. The government obviously was not an insurgent, so it doesn't make sense to talk about the same criteria. The other factor I would like to talk about is Afghan history is complex in a sense that a lot of people talk about urban elites, bubble and such, but you look at any country and the social change often requires some articulation of certain norms and values when you want to go through moments of change. I agree absolutely with Sangar that there does need to be some level of resonance with the population. Whatever you articulate a message, if it completely lacks resonance with the population, it's not relevant to their lives, I don't think we can get a lot of traction. But it requires articulation. So there is an intellectual element to any social change. And those intellectual elements always come from the elites. If you define elite as the people who are not kind of in the same position in regard to the resources that we consider important, some of those are soft resources like intellect and education. Some of it is just basically money and resources and power. So calling some of these ideas elite, that these are the ideas of the elite, I don't think it's a complete kind of it's not as much of a critic as many think it is. I think talking about how the fact that the elite were unable to articulate those ideas to the population and get traction for those, how there was a disconnect. And there was basically an echo chamber, they talking to each other, and sometimes looking down on Afghans and seeing them more as a nuisance to their mission than actually a partner or basically the clients for what they were selling, whatever it was. Leftists, I mean, was communism for the many in the post-2001 might have been democracy. I don't think they were seeing as their job as persuading a population to agree with them. Oftentimes they were seeing the population was the object of certain things to do too. Communists did the same thing. There was an Afghan society that needed to be something needed to be done to, and the NGOs, elite structure that emerged after the 2001 also saw Afghan population as something, as a group that something needs to be done to. And Afghans have become very smart at this. They see all of this as opportunities. They're making choices to align, to take someone's money. As Sangar said, a lot of people work with the US government who were basically Talibans. I mean, they came out completely as Taliban. They understood that maybe in order for me to receive certain benefits, to survive or to even thrive, I need to perform in a certain way now because of the facts that exist. And the elders we talk about, those elders show up to all the meetings that the US held. They made the same promises to the US military and Afghan governments. I mean, look at some of these election gatherings that are held, same kind of figures show up. So the whole fact that the project of social transformation, democracy building, whatever, had a huge problem of popularity, I think can be attributed to the fact that a lot of people who were in charge, elites, which had to be elites. I mean, often changes like that don't come from people in the village deciding, I want to imagine a different way to organize society. It doesn't know how it comes. But the elites in certain countries have been able to build mass support, communicate, persuade. Let's not go far. Iran. I mean, there were elements in Iran, religious class, that were holding huge mass speaks, talking to youth, trying to articulate their vision of what they wanted the Iran society to be against the Shah's regime or against other regimes. And they created building buy-in for their goals, and they managed to do something. It was revolution in a meaningful sense of the term, because it was a change in the society. Afghanistan has never experienced that. That is absolutely true. In the past 20 years, I think there was a space created that certain and changes occurred, and some of those changes are positive, some of those changes are maybe were not positive, but there were some of it positive. Looking at it right now from an Afghan perspective, my idea is that how you can actually organize the Afghan society in a way that Afghan would be a place where Afghans would like to live in. I take Adam's point, and I would actually combine Sangar's point to this. If you give the option to many Taliban fighters right now to go to the US, many would take that option. I will guarantee you that many would take that option. They are making the choices they do. I'm not saying the movement does not have ideological adherence to it. I'm saying that the ideology does not have buyer in Afghanistan. I'm not making the point. I'm making the point that many people making choices in Afghanistan right now in terms of aligning with certain groups, in terms of supporting certain movements, they don't see it as a realization of certain ideals, as often as sometimes assumed. My point is how you can make this place a place where Afghans would like to live in. Many who have contributed to the state that we are in would not like to live in Afghanistan that is emerging right now, for not just for economic reasons, just because they don't feel like this is a place they want to live in, and they may have better candidates out there they would like to choose. That is the question I'm interested in now, and you can bring history and other lessons to bear on this, but it's just a complex picture. I'm sorry.
But I think it's a really interesting way and a really interesting point also to turn this conversation into a little bit of a forward-looking conversation, right? So Haroun, I think I from you, it would be very helpful to hear what the different perspectives, what the different demands from different people within Afghanistan are. Who are these people? What are the different voices saying in Afghanistan? Sangar, from you, it would be really great for our audience if you could quickly sum up what the different voices on Afghanistan are saying, right? Whether it's diaspora or it's Europe, what the different voices on Afghanistan are saying. And from Adam, it would be really interesting to hear what voices on Afghanistan within the US are saying. I can give you very quickly a minute on the Pakistani scenario. I mean, we've had this scenario where our prime minister has made an awkward statement about Afghanistan having broken the shackles of slavery. And I am a little bit stumped as to why so many people have struggled to explain that in the public sphere. It has its roots very much in a narrative of compromised sovereignty in Pakistan, and sovereignty and national sovereignty as a value is one that has large-scale populist support in Pakistan. So this whole idea of national sovereignty as a function of a security state that feels a threat from essentially its eastern border, a sense of compromised sovereignty from the international community that most young Pakistanis feel has isolated them for such a long time, and also vilified them because the state has lost, credibility. And Adam, at some point, if you could also make a comment on why Pakistani messaging isn't quite landing in Washington the way the Pakistani state would like it to, right? So from Pakistan, there is, of course, a mixture of opinion. I can tell you at the moment, all hands are on deck from Peshawar to Karachi in terms of people who do want to host Afghans who are coming in. But there are also, the anti-refugee community is also starting to begin to have its say. And so these are the support from the Taliban is support for the Taliban, or rather the support for the ending of the US occupation in Afghanistan is what is, I think, the has the largest scale popular support in Pakistan. But anyway, who would like to go first?
I can go. I also, before I go, I wanted to react to two things Haroun said, but I think it relates to this question as well. One is that I think it's a very valid point that he made about, the lift in insurgency has to do versus what a government has to do are two very different things. And that was even true in the conduct of war, which is that the Taliban had the benefits of using IEDs and these kinds of tactics that I don't think the ANDSF and I'm not going to whitewash what NATO did or ISAF did, but they weren't planting IEDs on roads, and that will make a difference. I mean, in the South especially, it was an IED war. And so the Taliban were able to continue at a lower cost, I think, in many ways. Now, I also think when we talk about human rights, because this has to do with the U.S. narrative, I mean, there's a big human rights component to the U.S. narrative on Afghanistan. And speaking as an American about Afghans and Afghanistan is a minefield, because it's very easy to slip into an Orientalist narrative, or, you know, all various kinds of narratives. I mean, Afghans are not a monolith. It's very diverse. People think all kinds of things. Even the most supposedly out of touch Afghan is still more Afghan than I'll ever be. So it's a little bit, I cringe a little bit sometimes when I see Americans being like, this is an Afghan elite, or this is an Afghan in the diaspora, and they have no idea what they're talking about. I know what I'm talking about, you know? So I think that needs to be avoided. That being said, the issue with human rights and the human rights narrative and these normative values that we apply to Afghanistan isn't whether it's alien to Afghan society. I mean, look, Herat was considered very progressive, you know, in its history in many ways. It was a center of learning and all of this. It's not a matter of whether it's alien to the society, whether it can mesh with conservative elements of the rural society. For me, the issue with the human rights dialogue from the United States was that it was underwritten by the use of military force. Haroun is completely correct that change in society often comes from elite narratives that eventually get adopted by the wider society. But that's not the story of what we saw over the last 20 years. The story of what we saw is we saw these human rights advancements in particular parts of Afghanistan, and even in the rural areas to some degree. We saw a more inclusive society in some respects, but it was underwritten by the US military intervention, and it was a bloody intervention. It was a bloody intervention. Let's never forget that. And it was underwritten by an intervention that eventually was going to come to an end. And so we created these rapid gains in urban areas that were only sustainable, obviously, by the continuation of having US air power and US troops, and eventually that was going to come to an end. And we never grappled with the idea of, well, what happens when you build something very quickly, but its foundation is not self-sustaining, and then it's going to crumble, and what is the human cost of that? We never thought about that. We just built, and so that's my issue with the human rights narrative. I think genuine human rights advancements have to be organic, and they were organic in the cities. Like, yes, there were a lot of Afghan women and Afghan human rights activists who genuinely built things, but that can be true. And it can also be true that these gains were being guarded with US troops against a very motivated insurgency, and that was going to come to an end eventually. When we look at the US narrative on Afghanistan, I think there's a few different camps. There's the camp that genuinely just openly said, hey, we should stay in Afghanistan forever. There's a few of those people. You know, there's certain neoconservative think tanks that were very open about that. I think the majority of the anti-withdrawal crowd, you know, said, well, we need to stay until the conditions on the ground allow us to leave, which in my view, my critical view, was the equivalent of saying, well, let's just stay indefinitely, because I don't think the US military could affect conditions on the ground. Now, we could go back over the last 20 years. There were many decision points that, had they been made differently, had a different decision been made, we might be at a different outcome right now, for sure. The problem with military intervention is it's always going to incorporate human error. So, of course, bad decisions were made. That's how humans operate. So, yeah, we could look back, hindsight 2020, and say, well, if this decision and that decision had been made differently, the US military intervention could have fundamentally changed the society, and we'd be leaving an intact country that's not under complete Taliban rule right now. Fine. But that's not how any intervention will ever go. And then there's people who support the withdrawal, but and they genuinely think Afghanistan doesn't matter. I disagree with that position too. Afghanistan does matter. The stability of Afghanistan matters. The dignity of the Afghan people matter. There is a moral obligation to stay engaged. I just reject the idea that moral obligation means we had to keep troops in Afghanistan indefinitely. I reject that idea. And I think what's going to matter now is the United States willing to stay involved in Afghanistan diplomatically and economically if it doesn't have U.S. troops on the ground? I mean, do we have enough strategic foresight to realize that it's a mistake to just separate ourselves from the region? And same for Pakistan. I mean, right now you see a lot of people wanting to wipe their hands clean of Pakistan. Now Pakistan doesn't matter because we don't need these air and land routes or whatever. I mean, but we still do for the counterterrorism missions we want to be a part of. But you know, Pakistan's message doesn't land in Washington because it's kind of an incoherent message in which, you know, Imran Khan says one thing to one reporter and another thing to another reporter. And I very much understand that he has a domestic audience he has to speak to and they care about sovereignty and all of this. But yeah, it's when you say that.
No, I think you've made some critical points there, particularly. I mean, I think that's also true for what I'm seeing from the US discourse. There's a lot of, I didn't expect this to become, well, we knew that the US environment was electoral environment is particularly competitive, but I didn't expect this in its entirety to become a Republican versus Democrat conversation, right? And it seems like it's almost entirely geared towards a domestic audience.
Well, I don't even think it is. We had two, and I'll move on in a second because there's all these great questions coming through. But we had two administrations that are opposed to each other on all issues who made the political decision to withdraw. Look, the Biden administration can say it was beholden to Trump's agreement with the Taliban, but that's not completely true. They made a decision to withdraw as well. Both administrations made a decision that was based in U.S. strategic interests and also on the view of the country, the pulse of the country, which is that, yeah, maybe Afghanistan does not raise, whether we stay or go, does not raise to the priority level that Americans are out in the streets protesting. But by the way, in a functioning democracy, there shouldn't have to be mass protests for politicians to listen to the pulse of the people. I think both Trump and Biden did key into the pulse of the country that they just didn't think it made sense to stay involved 20 years. And I think there were some Afghans who thought that there was something more sinister at play, that there was lobbying or that there was some sort of plot against the Afghan government or whatever. But I think this has to do with domestic politics. And at the end of the day, the U.S. president and the U.S. military is accountable to the American people. It should be accountable to the American people. And the U.S. president is responsible for American lives and American interests first. And this is not the equivalent of saying Afghan lives don't matter or Afghanistan doesn't matter. But again, I mean, this is how every country in the world functions, accountable to their own interests first.
Sure. Sangar, if you don't mind, I'm going to go to Haroun first, just because he has to leave a little bit earlier than the rest of us. So.
Yes, I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Go for it. But Haroun, do also react to this, because Adam's made this really important point that everything that you've gained on human rights, it's been underscored by a military intervention, right? But that also means that there has been a system here that creates incentives for Afghans to rat on other Afghans, Afghans to hate Afghans. There have been incentives for that sort of divisiveness in a system that's essentially under an occupation. So what are the various Afghan, what happens when two different Afghanistans meet finally? The girl who's protesting in Kabul for her, or protesting in Jalalabad for her rights, who has never met a Talib before, and the Talib who has spent his life as an insurgent soldier, and probably his childhood as that as well, who hasn't encountered these cities before.
I think there are several good important points there. One is the fact that the way people feel about all those concepts. I would actually say buzzwords, human rights, democracy, and such. And I say word because sometimes if you present the underlying principle in different words, you get different reactions, right? How Afghans feel about human rights, quote unquote, democracy, women's rights, have been intertwined with how they felt about the government and the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. Both absolutely true. The real test will be how they will react to to a Taliban government trying to roll back on some of those issues, what will be the reaction with the U.S. intervention and U.S. backing out of the picture? I think we saw some of the senses of what it could look like. There was a rather spontaneous, organic, bottom-up reaction around gathering around the flag, the symbol of flag. Yeah. That was spread even in areas that many people would not have expected. Like Jalalabad would not be people's first choice of someone standing up for the past 20 years. Some elements of the past 20 years that they saw in the symbol of flag. Obviously, Pashtun nationalism was intertwined with the idea of the flag as well. It is a complex picture. I don't want to discount that. But again, we also saw some of the people just going on the street, as you said, women going on the street, men going to the street around the symbol of flag, or just around the other elements of the past 20 years, trying to organize some sort of resistance. How will those continue? How they will be? How Taliban are going to react to those? Just going to be open questions. I don't know. I think there is going to be some sort of reckoning. And if Taliban are going to use anything short of brute force, they will have to be flexible on some of those fronts. They may have to introduce gradual elements. They have to allow for some regional flexibility in the country. How they're going to institutionalize it is a different question. But right now, you see some of it organically happening, just because there are pronouncements coming from out of Kandahar are not the pronouncements coming out of Kabul. Pronouncements from the Taliban officials coming out of Herat are not pronouncements that are coming out of, for example, Khos. I mean, it is just that is naturally happening. Different level of accommodation, just because of the fact that the different parts of the country feel differently about many of these issues. How is it going to be institutionalized? That's a different question. Formal institutions matter. They matter under
local shades will color the complexion of Taliban governance. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's an open question. It is the point I was making earlier was that just because the government collapsed, it doesn't mean that the Taliban narrative won. There are a lot of people who actually are willing to organize and resist against Taliban. What will they organize around? What are principles and such? I really don't know yet. The flag was organically came out at some point. There's nothing Taliban understood enough or smart enough to understand and back down from the issue of flag, because they, I think, felt that was a sensitive issue at the moment. I don't think, because there was a question about the Panjshir, I don't think Panjshir is going to be the main issue of resistance moving forward. Panjshir has limited constituency in Afghanistan. There are certain elements of the country that feel strongly about Panjshir and what the resistance in Panjshir is going to represent. But it's not going to be the national resistance that's going to force Taliban to make compromises on important issues. It's not simply going to be that. It is going to be a political issue they have to deal with regard to a certain constituency. It is important. It's an important constituency, but it's not a national resistance movement. How and what the national resistance movement is going to be, I really don't know. I'm committed to trying to deconstruct some of those elements of human rights and democracy and talk about some of the underlying principles and present them to people and see how many are willing to stand up for it, organize for it, work for it. I don't think we know that. Some are just looking for the door. I think a lot of people may feel like they would rather disengage. Not like Americans. Many Afghans choose to leave. Refugee. I mean, Hirschman had the person who won a Nobel Prize. He talked about voice and exit. You have two options. You can, if you don't like the organization institutions you're in, you can voice and say, let's change this, or you can just exit. I don't know. Refugee is and vote is basically saying, I don't like this. I'm leaving. I don't want to even change it. The other option is voice. People are standing up, making sacrifices, trying to change the system. Both options are going to be exercised by different people. How those exercises are going to affect the character of the nation and the political system is going to emerge, I really don't know. The last thing I want to say is that the Taliban are the only organized force with the capacity to use violence at a large scale right now. So it is going to a lot depend on how they're going to react to these movements.
Has ISK at the airport not challenged that?
I really don't think ISK is going to be a major factor moving forward. They always had sleeper cells. They could do certain attacks. I really don't think it's going to be the it's not going to be Taliban versus ISKP the same way it was government versus Taliban. Sorry. I'm going to pause here. Thank you so much for giving the time. I'm so sorry I have to go a little bit earlier. I
No, that's
misunderstood.
perfectly all right. But thank you for being with us, Haroun. We'll have you back because we have conceived this as a series of conversations. For a very long time, I have wanted for more Pakistanis and Afghans to talk to each other and hear from each other instead of us sitting in a third country and kind of talking at each other across tables, which has happened for at least the better part of the last 15 years that I have seen. So I'm really, really grateful to you for the time. I know it's a very difficult time, and you've made
time. Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you, Sangar and Adam, both of you. I've learned a lot just listening to you guys. Appreciate it.
Take care. Thank you, Haroun. Sangar, you said Taliban have changed, but that doesn't mean they are now intersectional, decolonialist, anti-racist feminists. Stop asking if they have changed when your criteria for change are unrealistic for the Afghan context. So tell us your views, and then we'll go to some more audience questions. And by the way, Adam and Sangar, feel free to answer any of these. We have about 6 or 7 audience questions in the box. Haroun's already answered the one on Panjshir, but yeah. Go for it, Sangar. The floor is yours.
Thank you. As I explained in beginning of this conversation, modern ideas about human rights, about gender, about what is the right way to treat other people, what are now called universal, are not actually universal. They are a product of a process, and they're very closely tied to wealth and power in Western countries. Now, in other parts of the world where those important factors, such as power, historic events, wealth, all those matters, when those matters have not evolved, those historic occurrences never happened, you cannot expect people from those areas to basically adopt ideas just out of nothing. And this is also very important when you try to understand a group like Taliban. The Taliban are very conservative, even for most Afghan standards. Okay, and that's because even in very liberal communities in Afghanistan, the local mullah is much more conservative than the people who pray behind him. Okay. Because the mullah or the imam stands for certain values and beliefs, and it doesn't mean that the majority of society, everyone, behaves and acts exactly the way the religious leader preaches. It's never the same. It's even here in the Netherlands, we have these very conservative Christian communities where they don't allow their children to watch TV. It exists. These things exist here. But that doesn't mean that all Christian communities that are conservative here in this country are exactly like their preacher, like their pastor. But what happens is that in Afghanistan, we have a political movement that consists primarily of people who are religious leaders, imams or students of religious leaders. So obviously their values, their beliefs, and their outlook on world is very conservative. And if that movement changes and evolves, which any human organization changes and evolves over the course of the years, so does the Taliban. So yes, they have changed in certain respects. Like, for instance, in the 1990s, their dominant view was that taking of pictures is absolutely prohibited. Now, from a non-Muslim perspective, from perspective of people who don't know much about Islamic jurisprudence, that would sound like, okay, these people are just outright crazy rejectionists. But the idea of not taking pictures or photos is deeply rooted in Islamic tradition, in Islamic legal philosophy. It's not just a crazy idea. But those ideas can be challenged by other scholars. Those ideas can actually be reinterpreted. The people can change their stance regarding those matters. And you see that now the Taliban are taking selfies. Even their leaders, religious leaders, scholars among the Taliban allow pictures. It's not because they have suddenly become very progressive and liberal and secular. No, because they have witnessed all these debates within Muslim world about pictures and all these matters, and they have learned that there are different ideas about these matters. So that's why we have to also accept the fact that while the Taliban are very conservative and they differ on many issues with the rest of the society, the only way where we can reach some sort of mutual understand is to actively engage people, actively talk to them, and allow different ideas to penetrate the society, to penetrate the dialogue. And I'm very optimistic about that because I've
Sangar,
seen.
Asif Karim is asking if a Taliban run Afghanistan is going to lead to a reduction in violence and terrorism. So both Sangar and Adam, what do you think about that?
Adam, please go first.
Well, it already has led to a reduction in violence. Whether that's sustainable will be, to some extent, up to how the Taliban govern, which we haven't seen yet. They haven't really declared a government yet. I mean, it's looking like it's going like an emirate, but they're also talking to local power brokers. Who knows what's going to happen? I mean, obviously, ISKP is going to be a problem going forward. But look, the end of this war, in a sense, is going to certainly lead to a reduction in violence. Of course, human experience in life is not only measured by security, it's also measured by economic opportunity, by civil liberties, and by all of these other things. So the reduction of violence on its own is not enough to govern Afghanistan. I think the Taliban have really doubled down on, we're going to provide security. And of course, that's a positive thing, but they're going to have to provide more than security. And by the way, I should pitch that Haroun had an article in Responsible Statecraft a couple of months ago, which is a publication associated with the Quincy Institute, about what constitution making with the Taliban might look like, and much of it still applies. He also had an interesting thread about Panjshir that I think he began to speak about, but there's a thread on Twitter, if you find his Twitter account, that was quite interesting. So yeah, I think violence is going to reduce in the short term, but this is an opportunity. Like, the Taliban have one opportunity to get governance right and be inclusive to some degree. I agree with what Sangar is saying. You can't measure them against an unrealistic Western standard. Have they changed? Have they not changed? What I've seen so far is that I think they understand optics a little bit better. You see them meeting with Hazara leaders, you see them meeting with Shia leaders, you see them meeting with former stakeholders. Is that going to translate into genuine change? They're still a very ideological group. They're still an extremely conservative group. A little bit of inclusivity would go a long way,
Well, I've wondered often, because, the way that the media and the Taliban's treatment of the media is breaking down, it looks like there may be, I'm wondering, I'm speculating if the Taliban might apply a different set of rules that represent the emirate to state institutions, to public sector institutions, and allow space for the private sector. So you may not see, for instance, women anchor persons on state radio and TV, but you will continue to see female representatives on the media continuing to work for Tolo. I'm wondering if that is the line around which perhaps they will strike a balance. But anyway, Adam, just before we're at we're 5 minutes out, so I wanted to bring it down to a wrap up. And you, of course, I can't let you go without this question, because this is Pakistan. You have a question about Indian lobbyists and their power in Washington, D.C., because a lot of Pakistanis are seeing the flurry of articles that have come out sort of decrying Pakistan's role. And they're wondering if, kind of what that means. and what that means for the region.
I don't think Indian lobbyists have much influence over U.S. opinion, and I think even in the case of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the United States doesn't necessarily view what's going on in Afghanistan as an extension of that per se. Now, there's folks who will argue we should stay in Afghanistan because so we can have a base that we could use against China, but that's an American perspective. That's not seen as a way to convince India to stay on board. Look, the reality is that there's much of the messaging that comes out of Pakistan has been self-destructive for itself. And even when we
Absolutely.
And when India, the Modi government did India an incredible disservice based on what it was doing in Kashmir. And there was a time when public opinion in the United States was actually shifting against India. That was not due to Pakistan's messaging on Kashmir. That was due to the BJP's dismal policies in Kashmir. And so in both cases of India and Pakistan, when we see their popularity or when we see public opinion shifting on them, it really is almost always a self-inflicted wound, whether it be India committing gross human rights abuses in Kashmir or Pakistan having ridiculous messaging and committing its own human rights abuses at times. The reality is that the majority of Americans don't even think about India or Pakistan.
Right.
It doesn't even enter the mind of the average American. So
Sure.
We're talking about elite politics here. And I think the technocratic state and the connections between the Pakistani and U.S. intelligence services and the militaries will always continue forward. I hope to see the relationship become improved. But the flurry of articles you see against Pakistan, part of it is a self-inflicted wound of messaging, and part of it is America's own delusions where we can't accept our own failure in Afghanistan, so we have to scapegoat Pakistan. It's half and half.
So we're 3 minutes out from closing. Final thoughts, 1 minute each. Sangar.
I would say that to the Pakistani audience, it is very important to understand that what is being said in the media and what is being said by politicians should be understood as merely representing the interests of certain groups. What is very important is that we need to understand relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan as a human relationship between two neighboring countries. And while Pakistanis feel very strongly about Afghanistan, their sentiments often blind them for certain facts, and that is that instability in Afghanistan directly results to instability in Pakistan. Human beings on both sides will suffer, and therefore I advocate that we as Afghans do not propagate hostility towards Pakistanis, not even against Americans. But at the same time, I would also say that Pakistanis need to also reflect upon their messaging, their attitude, and their advocacy towards Afghanistan. For instance, supporting the previous government or supporting the Taliban and assuming that either the previous government was 100% okay and good, or the Taliban are great and wonderful. Those are not the two positions that need to be taken.
Right. But Sangar, if there's one constructive thing that the Pakistan government can do right now, what would that be?
I would say that they need to try to engage with all groups in Afghanistan.
Right.
And treat all different political trends not as they are our friends and the others are not, and they are supported by India. They have to treat every group individually as representative of particular constituency and build a relationship with all groups. That would be very beneficial for both countries.
Thank you. Adam, final thoughts.
I think the most constructive thing Pakistan could do would be to view Afghanistan as important in and of itself and not as an extension of the Pakistan-India dynamic. Of course, that would take a leap of faith, but I think that's one of the most constructive things Pakistan could do. I think one of the most constructive things the United States could do would be to realize that Afghanistan still matters, even if we don't have troops there. And by the way, Pakistan matters on account that it's one of the most populated countries in the world. It's a nuclear power. It has, an educated population, a growing educated population. It's important in and of itself. And that Pakistan shouldn't be viewed solely through the counterterrorism lens or the Afghanistan lens. And Afghanistan shouldn't be solely viewed through the U.S., the U.S. war on terror lens. I mean, all of us, if we could just, oftentimes our criticisms of each other as states, Pakistan's criticism of the U.S. war in Afghanistan was often quite apt, and Washington's criticism of the way Pakistan viewed that war was often quite apt, and we were completely blind to each other's criticism. If we could step back and look at the bigger picture, I think that would be very important. And for the United States, look, I'm obviously a critic of the Taliban. My ideal scenario was not that the Taliban take over the entire government. If things could have gone perfectly, I think it would have looked like a transitional government. The peace process at Doha would have had a better outcome. That's not where we're at. We need to accept reality. Reality is that Taliban are governing right now. What can we do? What are achievable goals? Let's stop focusing on things just because they sound good that are not achievable. Let's stop assuming that if the United States engages or disengages, it's, all legitimacy of a movement just turns on what the US does. No, let's make sure money is coming out of ATMs in Afghanistan. Let's make sure food is getting to vulnerable populations in Afghanistan. Let's make sure that the power grid is still up in Afghanistan. You care about human rights. You care about the ability of people to become educated and some level of oversight over the Taliban movement. Well, if there's no internet and there's no electricity, all of that stops. So I think what's important now is to make sure that the ship of Afghanistan stays afloat, regardless of who the captain is. And if we can influence the captain a little bit, and right now that's the Taliban, well, more power to us. I think not having a diplomatic presence in Afghanistan, which seems to be the direction that the United States is going right now, that would be an incredible mistake. So I guess that's where I'll leave it.
No, thank you. And I think that that's the most urgent question on the table right now is how will Afghanistan survive the growing economic crisis? And should policy making turn in a direction that actually causes an economic apartheid of Afghanistan? As somebody who watches the borders, I mean, I really, that would be a worst case scenario for so many of the most vulnerable people who in the best of times need support. So I think, thank you so much for your reflections. We wanted this to be more of a personal conversation about how people are seeing what has happened and how people see the future. And we plan to continue to have these conversations. So I hope that you will be back with us. But thank you very much for your time. नाजरीन, अगर आपको कोई ऐसा मरहला है इस सेशन में जिसका तर्जुमा चाहिए तो मैं आपको वो तर्जुमा लिख के भेज दूंगी. उसके अलावा अगर आपके कोई ऐसे सवालात हैं जिनका जवाब आप चाहते हैं तो भेज दीजिएगा, हम अपने पैनलिस्ट्स को भेज देंगे. Thank you. बहुत शुक्रिया. And thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure. Sangar, Adam, and also Haroun, who's not with us anymore.
Thank you.
On behalf of ThinkFest, good night.